Hey there, folks. I'm Michael Tomasky. I'm the editor of the New Republic, and welcome to this special little episode of TNR video where we're going to be talking about the Democratic Convention, which, as you all know, just wrapped up last night. And as you can see with me are two of our terrific staff writers, Grace Segers. Say hi, Grace.
Hello.
And Greg Sargent.
Everybody.
Grace went to Chicago as I did. Greg did not, but he watched and he obviously will have a lot to say about it. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And it was a really, really fascinating week. And we're going to be talking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take your questions. So please hang with us and put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll devote some respectable amount of time to those. So let's start with Grace. Though I was in Chicago, I wasn't in the hall last night because I had a really early flight and I decided just to watch it at my Airbnb. I was in the hall the first 3 nights. So you're the only one in this meeting who was in the hall last night, Grace. So tell us what the mood was like while Kamala Harris spoke.
So I was in the hall, but only nominally. So I do think that this is important to go through the logistics here. I
Yeah.
was in a designated press section that was in the absolute nosebleeds of the nosebleeds of the United Center, literally as far up as you can get and
Yeah.
still see the stage.
I've
Um,
been,
and I think it's significant that so many people wanted to get into the hall that they ended up closing it off entirely at around 7 p.m. And this caused a lot of frustration with reporters because they had let a lot of non-reporters into spaces that were allegedly reserved for press. So there's a lot of frustration on that regard. But it does speak to how many people were really eager to be in the room. And again, this is an arena where the Bulls play, where whatever the Chicago hockey team is, I don't know, sports, where they play, where concerts are held. So it is packed with tens of thousands of people. And when Harris took the stage, the screams, which were already pretty deafening, just became absolutely ear splitting. And same when she announced in her speech that she was accepting the nomination for the presidency, the screams were so intense that I, again, at the very, very top of the arena, my ears hurt. To be fair, I'm recovering from a concussion, so it doesn't take very
oh,
much for my ears
geez.
to hurt.
Yeah.
But it was a lot. It was loud. And I think that just spoke to the overall enthusiasm. People were thrilled to be there. And just the excitement kept building and building and building through the end of the night, which a rumor had started Beyonce would be there.
Yeah.
Beyonce was not there, obviously. But even without Beyonce, people were just absolutely pumped and waving their American flags, waving their signs that said Kamala. It was definitely a different, jubilant vibe than what I'm sure we would have seen had the convention occurred a month and a half ago and we had a different name at the top of the ticket.
Boy, I kept thinking that, that's for sure. I'll add my own quick little logistics note. I was there, as I said, the first 3 nights. There were 5 sections in the top level, in the nosebleed section, that were reserved for members of the media. On the first 3 nights, you could go to those sections and find a seat. They filled up those sections by 9 o'clock or so, but if you went at 7, there were plenty of seats. On Thursday night, I went at 6:30 and those sections were closed. They weren't letting people in already at that point. And so that's when I decided just to go watch it at home. Uh, Greg, how did it look to you from the suburbs of Maryland?
I had a question about the Beyonce thing, just to take a little aside here, if I could. I was wondering if it was some kind of dirty trick, actually. If, like some really low-level dirty trick where someone tried to spread a rumor saying, oh, this is going to be a great show, and then to supposedly deflate everybody or something like that. To me, it looked, I mean, I was absolutely blown away by both the speech, but maybe more broadly by the spectacle. The American flags, the nonstop cheering, the intense enthusiasm and jubilation, I think sent a strong message to the country about the state of the Democratic Party, and in many ways, maybe about liberalism in a sense, the health of liberalism right now. It was a very liberal speech, I thought, and a very pro-democracy, pro-liberal democracy speech. A lot of strong paeans to values and stuff. That combined with the cheering, I think, was a very powerful thing.
I agree, and I want to talk more about that. But another aspect of the speech, of course, was the biography part in the earlier sections of the speech, because she is letting America get to know her. And I haven't seen numbers yet on how many people watched, but I'm sure it was high. I would imagine it was higher than Donald Trump's, which the Democrats will make sure he knows. So, Grace, what did you think of the parts of the speech where she was telling America who she is?
We haven't really seen Harris talk about her background at this scale before. She usually doesn't delve too deeply into her own upbringing. She does talk occasionally about her mother, who was a breast cancer researcher, and her father as well. But usually it's in smaller settings and interviews in the autobiography that she wrote, I want to say in 2018. Up to this point, she has not talked about her family and her upbringing to the American people. So this was really the first time that she was explaining where she came from. And I think it was important that she started off her speech with an introduction, because even though she's been vice president for past almost 4 years, even though she was senator before that, California AG before that, she's been well known on the national scale for a long time.
Yeah.
But who she actually is wasn't necessarily as well known. So for her to delve into that background before getting into the policy, I think was very smart as a sort of political reintroduction to the American people. And then also framing her background in very sympathetic terms, daughter of immigrants, daughter who was primarily raised by her mother. That is a story that she knew would connect with a lot of people, and it makes sense to me that she would start her speech that way.
Yeah, a whole lot about her mother, not much about her father. It seems like her father was probably pretty absent after the divorce. But I thought that little story, Greg, about how they took in that gal who had been sexually abused by her parent or step parent, I forget which, was kind of moving and defining.
Yes, and I thought that what that also accomplished, in addition to sort of filling in her motives for going into public service,
Yeah,
is that it really kind of illustrated where she gets the kind of community values that she talked about. It kind of put some meat on those bones in a sense. It showed her acting, on behalf of others around her who are suffering. And by the way, I do want to say, though, before we lose this, that she really led with the immigrant roots, which I was very struck by. I actually was talking to an immigration advocate before the speech who was absolutely convinced that she would not mention the fact that her mother was an immigrant.
yeah.
A lot of immigration advocates right now are very sour on Democrats because of the bipartisan border security bill and so forth. But she leaned in.
Yeah.
She leaned into those roots and really made a strong case, I think, that her story is a thoroughly American one.
I think that's right, and that was really interesting. So let's extend out from that and talk a little bit more directly about race here. Obviously, she is a Black woman, and she's a mixed race woman, but she identifies chiefly as Black, seems to, went to Howard University. And obviously, she'd be the first Black woman president of the United States. She didn't talk about that. A few people talked about that, but I don't think they laid that on particularly heavily over the course of the 4 nights. So I think, Grace, that as I wrote this morning, and I thought this was a pretty good line. Occasionally I write something that I think was a pretty good line. For the people to whom her identity is really important, it's there and it's obvious and it carries its meaning without having to be discussed. And for the people to whom her identity doesn't really matter that much, well, it doesn't matter that much, and they'll vote for her for other reasons. But I'm really struck by that, and that's a hard thing for a Black woman to carry off. And I think we're not going to hear anybody say that America will never elect a Black woman or this Black woman. Do you agree or disagree with that? What are your
Well,
thoughts?
first, I would disagree with you that I don't think she identifies primarily as a Black woman. I think she identifies as both in equal parts.
Uh-huh.
She's clearly very proud of both elements of her heritage. She went to Howard University, but she's also done, Indian cooking
Right.
videos with Mindy Kaling.
Oh,
I,
that's true.
I think
Yeah.
both of these are very important to who she is and how she identifies. But at the same time, as you say, she's not highlighting this as heavily. And I do think that's perhaps lessons learned from the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016,
Mm.
where Hillary Clinton so heavily campaigned on the possibility of being the first woman president on the slogan of "I'm with her," and that's
Breaking the glass
probably
ceiling and all that. Yeah.
breaking glass ceiling. I don't think that's why she lost. We could be here all
Yeah.
day, all year to talk about why she
Let's
lost.
do that.
But that is something that I think the Harris campaign and Harris herself probably internalized, that that could turn off, rightly or wrongly, voters who don't really want to think about her identity. And for, as you say, the voters who care about it, that will be very meaningful to them, but not necessarily something that she needs to campaign on. I also think that the question of, is America ready for a Black woman president, is no offense to you, but kind of an annoying question. Was America ready for the first Black president? Is America ready for the first woman president? The answer is we don't know until
Yeah.
election day happens. And there are plenty of people who would have told you up until November, whatever, early November 2008, that the United States was not ready for its first Black president. And then we
Right.
had Obama for 8 years.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of the wrong question. The question isn't, is America ready for the first Black woman president, first woman president, but rather, how important is identity to the voting public? And that question, we just aren't going to know the answer until November 8th. I don't remember when election day is. I'm tired. It's been a long week.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. And I wasn't really raising the question like I was raising it. I was raising it with the knowledge that others are going to be raising it. I think America is perfectly ready, is what I was trying to say, is that I think America is perfectly ready to elect her president. Greg?
Yeah, I think in a way there's an interesting tension here. On the one hand, it's absolutely true that Democrats are maybe more wary of leaning into the barrier breaking nature of this candidacy because of what happened with Hillary. And so they're really definitely not front loading that in the way that Hillary did. But at the same time, because of the election of Obama, a lot of Democrats today, I think, are really much more optimistic about the readiness of the country to elect a Black woman.
Mhm.
So there's sort of two things going on at once. One is that that Democrats feel confident the country's ready, and the other is that they don't feel the need to sort of talk about it all the time. But yeah, I do think it's clear that that's another thing, by the way, that I think explains this joy that we keep talking about, and this jubilation is the sort of confidence and optimism that the country doesn't see this as a barrier anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So there was one note of controversy yesterday. about the decision not to allow a Palestinian American speaker at the podium, a state representative from Georgia, woman who was offered by the people who were negotiating this with the DNC as the speaker, and they even presented a text that she might deliver. But the DNC said no. What do you think about that, Grace?
Well, it was very interesting to see the protests outside of the United Center beginning on Wednesday and then carried on throughout Thursday as it became clear that there would not be a speech from a Palestinian American lawmaker. I think there had been a lot of concern that this DNC in Chicago would be a rerun of the 1968 DNC with a lot of protests. We did not see that. There were definitely protests in the surrounding area about the Biden administration's response to the conflict in Gaza. But even on the inside with the sit-in that uncommitted delegates and supporters were holding outside the United Center, it was very peaceful. It was simply a request to be heard. And I think it's pretty obvious the calculation that the National Democratic Party made is that they can afford to upset these people. The calculation they're making is that they're either going to come home and vote for Harris, or they aren't going to be a large enough number of sort of dissidents to sway the election one way or another. It's a bit of a risk when you are talking about an election that is dependent on states that will be decided by a few thousand votes. But it's clearly a risk they were willing to take. And if you looked at State Representative Ruah Rahman's speech, she shared it with, I believe, Mother Jones first. But her speech was a pretty full-throated endorsement of Kamala Harris and of the Democratic Party. It did not say the word genocide. And then when you looked at sort of the timing of the event yesterday, at one point they were running early and they had a DJ who was playing music in between speakers, just vamping. So the fact that you had a DJ playing songs for 10 minutes with a dead space, you could have put a speech from a Palestinian American in there, and they chose not to. That said, one final thing I will say about this is Harris did make not the strongest commitment that she could have, and certainly not one that will make a lot of people passionate about this issue feel satisfied. But she did say that she believed Palestinians were deserving of their dignity and respect and self-determination. And that's really not something that we hear American lawmakers say very often. So to hear a major party nominee say that on the stage of their party convention, I do think is significant, and I think will speak to the vast majority of people who are passionate about this issue, even if it does not persuade the small minority that are feeling very angry and hurt right now.
Yeah, I thought her language was pretty good. I know that there was a lot of negotiation about her language involving a lot of interested parties, and people were pushing for a little bit more. But you know, it got at least some of the way there. As for the speaking engagement, Greg, I think that was kind of a cell phone on their part. I think the woman's an elected state representative. You know, she's not a spokesperson for Hamas. I mean, she's endorsed Kamala Harris. I think I can't see what harm it would have done to have her up there for 5 to 7 minutes.
I agree. I do want to say that interested parties is kind of an understatement, I think. But
Right.
you know, I think people were really very closely monitoring every syllable, and there was probably a lot of vicious fighting over every syllable too. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that happened. I want to second what you both are saying here, that it was a strange oversight. My strong suspicion is that they're making a calculation that runs a little something like this. There's now a $500 million effort to portray her as culturally alien and threatening.
Yeah.
In addition to, not nearly tough enough to keep you safe. And so they think that being associated with this kind of spectrum of things, I don't know, campus radicals, Palestinian activists is just a bridge too far for them. I think they're wrong about that. I can kind of see why they made the calculation, though. I do think maybe another factor here was a bit of uncertainty about the degree to which they could ultimately control the message of the speaker on the stage. I don't think that's really a legit concern, but I can kind of see it.
I think in general, just to broaden this out and talk about the stagecraft of the overall 4 nights. Of course, things ran long on Monday night, and that was probably an unforced error. But I thought overall the presentation was really smart. The selection of speakers, the order of speakers, the issues emphasized, the emphasis on Project 2025 every night, the emphasis on January 6th a little bit every night, and just the emphasis on abortion and choice and reproductive freedom. The pounding away of the word, I don't know how many times the word freedom was said by different people, but it had to be in the dozens. I just thought as stagecraft, it was really well produced. Grace?
Well, a party convention is in many ways for the faithful. It is not necessarily on the whole for the larger audience of people who don't really care about politics. If you are tuning into the DNC, it's because you really care about politics for the most part. And I would say that the people who were there were so excited to be there. And the stagecraft, the production was clearly very plotted out and was, for the most part, implemented pretty smoothly. What's interesting to me was the 4th night, knowing that if you are an American who is only vaguely aware of what's happening politically, and you want to know what's up with Kamala Harris, you're not going to tune in on the first 3 nights. Maybe you'll tune in for Tim Walz, but probably not. You will tune in probably for the 4th night when Harris is going to speak, and maybe Beyonce will be there. So I thought it was very interesting the emphasis that was placed on the 4th night on the Democratic veteran lawmakers all coming out on stage, on former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger coming and making an overt call to his fellow Republicans to appreciate Democrats as patriots who care about their country just as much as Republicans do. You had several references to Ronald Reagan. You had Leon Panetta on stage. And then you had the person who introduced Harris was the Democrat governor of a pinkish state, North Carolina. So this was very much the evening of we are going to show to the American people that we are normal and trustworthy and patriotic. And Harris had a line in her speech about the pride and privilege of being an American, which struck me as a phrase that you could hear in a political speech of any party. That could be a Republican line. And this today or yesterday, they're really saying Republicans don't corner the market on saying that they are patriotic, saying that they support freedom. And so as far as it went for all 4 days, the first 3 days to me seemed like very much about let's amp up Democrats. The final day was very much about let's try to reach the people who may not be as tuned in.
Greg, I want your general thoughts, but I want to ask you quickly one specific thing, which Grace mentioned. They could have chosen any Democrat in the country, of course, to be the last speaker before Kamala Harris, and they chose Roy Cooper. Why?
Well, North Carolina's in play, maybe.
Yeah.
Don't you think? I mean, by all the polling I've seen, it of course strikes us all as far-fetched every cycle, and then it turns out to be far-fetched every cycle, right? It just doesn't seem to be gettable except for by Barack Obama, under particularly difficult circumstances for the country economically. Yeah, I think probably that was the calculation, that if you force them to spend a lot of money in North Carolina at an absolute minimum, meaning Republicans, force Trump and Republicans to put a lot of resources in there, it diverts stuff from the Rust Belt and from Arizona, from Nevada, and it just generally puts a whole lot of pressure on the Trump campaign and on the Republican Party, and keeps those multiple paths open for Kamala Harris.
Let's talk quickly about Tim Walz. I think he rose to the occasion, and I think that he's made people forget, most people, that they wanted Josh Shapiro. Grace?
I don't know that most people wanted Josh Shapiro.
No, I mean the people who did. No, I didn't say most. Most of the people who wanted Josh Shapiro have forgotten that they wanted Josh Shapiro.
No, I think that's true. And I think when you looked at the speeches of her other potential vice presidential contenders, so that includes Roy Cooper before he withdrew himself, but also Mark Kelly and Josh Shapiro doing his best Obama impression. I think Walz really showed that for this moment and for the balance that he needed to bring for the ticket, he was the right choice. Because they're trying to emphasize joy. That is their spiel. That is what they are working on doing. And Tim Walz is just like, he looks like Santa without the beard. He is a happy looking guy. And he brings a lot of that, what they call Minnesota nice vibes to the ticket. And so I think that this was a strong introduction for him. We know that most Americans don't really know who he is. Something that was pointed out to me by some folks that I was chatting with who are from Wisconsin is that a lot of people in Western Wisconsin are in the Minnesota media market. So people in Wisconsin, especially Western Wisconsin, really know Tim Walz. And someone joked to me that people in Western Wisconsin may think that he's their governor instead of Tony Evers, who actually is the Wisconsin governor. So I know some folks were saying, well, what's the point of putting someone from Minnesota, a relatively safe, likely Democratic state, on the ticket? And I think that there is definitely an appeal to the larger Midwest that his nomination brings.
I think for sure. You know, Greg, it's often said that the choice of a vice presidential nominee is the first quasi-presidential decision that a presidential nominee makes. If that's true, and I think it's plausible, then I think it's pretty fair to say that Kamala Harris got an A+ and Donald Trump got something a little less than that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely clear. I think the magnitude of the J.D. Vance disaster still isn't fully apparent to all of us. I just want to say something else, though. In retrospect, Biden's decision to tap Harris now looks like an inspired act of real statesmanship on behalf of the country, doesn't it? I mean, really yes, he really refused to get out of the race and let her run for far too long, but he did pick someone who is eminently prepared to lead and is prepared to run a campaign against the rising forces of authoritarianism, which Biden himself identified as a fundamental threat to the nation.
Yeah, and I guess, Walz also, he represents, ideologically, I think what Harris is trying to communicate and where she's trying to position herself. She's liberal. Once the Democrats got control of the entire state government in Minnesota, they passed a lot of things that you could call liberal things, certainly. But Walz talks about those things, Grace, in very common sense terms. Like the way he answered the thing to Jake Tapper a couple of weeks ago about the free breakfasts and the free school lunches, where he just, it was just a very common sense way of saying, well, I think kids ought to go to school with a full stomach. What do you think about that? So it's a programmatically liberal agenda, but a rhetorically commonsensical architecture around it is my perception. Grace, what do you think?
So one thing I would like to delve into a little bit here with Walz, we've talked a bit about gender in the race in terms of Harris's gender, but I think that far more important to this race actually is masculinity and different conceptions of masculinity.
Yeah.
Because on the ticket, you see two very different examples and conceptions of what an American man is and what an American man should be.
Yeah.
So you have the masculinity embodied by the Trump Vance ticket, which is very macho, has a lot of insistence on toughness, on traditional family gender roles. And then on the other hand, you have the Harris-Walz ticket. You have Doug Emhoff presenting himself very much as a wife guy. You have Walz himself, who sort of embodies a more kind and gentler version of what a man should be. Like, you can be a football coach, but also the teacher who's part of the Gay Straight Alliance and a founder of that. And I think that how he talks about policy is very much in keeping with his idea of what being a man is. So the idea that, yes, you want to protect your family, you want to protect your loved ones, but how you do that is by ensuring that kids go to school on a full stomach, and being a good dad. And one thing that really struck me, and this is a bit of a tangent here, but Tim Walz's son, Gus, who has several learning disabilities, became a bit of a breakout star on Wednesday night with his very passionate response to seeing his father on stage, accepting the nomination as vice president. And Gus was just openly weeping. It's a very moving sight to see a son so excited and proud of his father. But it's very much not what people who believe in traditional masculine roles expect to see. The idea of boys don't cry is still so pervasive in this society. And this was really an example of a young man, a teenager, who was very proud and feeling emotional, and so he was crying.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is really perhaps the most interesting conversation about gender that we can have in this race right now, is looking at the two types of masculinity embodied by the ticket and looking at where young men who we know are feeling very alienated and isolated right now, where are they going to go? Where are they going to turn when it comes down to November? And I think that's very interesting. I sort of hijacked your question.
No, that's okay. You took it in an interesting direction, so I'm gonna keep going that way, Greg. I've felt for a long time that our political culture and political journalism specifically are really far behind where the country's collective brain is on these kinds of questions, and just reverts to old cliches that are just old and dead. So let me introduce this piece of evidence. some years ago, the American Film Institute did a survey of the greatest hero, the greatest male hero in American filmdom. Okay. Was it Rambo? No. Was it John Wayne in some John Ford Western shooting a bunch of people? No. It was Atticus Finch. Okay. It was Atticus Finch. Now, I guess that's a bunch of film critics talking, although I think it had people participate too. But anyway, Greg, there have been different conceptions of masculinity that people have embraced in this country for a long time, I think.
Yeah, I want to sort of amplify all this in a bit of a different way. I think what all this ends up being reducible to is basic decency, right? So Tim Walz is not just campaigning on an alternate version of masculinity to that of Donald Trump, though he is doing that. He's basically saying that, you know, you can be a confident man and also treat people decently, like treat other people like human beings. And I really do think that that basic idea is absolutely central to the entire spectacle they put on. Everything is about that, from the starting ad that Kamala put out, in which everybody's laughing and having a good time with each other. Through Tim Walz's speech, he's offering this kind of version of rural masculinity that's all about decency and the right kind of community, not the kind of community that's founded on exclusion and hostility to outsiders. It's an inclusive kind of community. And I do think that this is what they're basically saying. The message of this convention, or one of them, the central ones, is we can treat each other well. We can feel good about each other again. We don't have to feel the way Donald Trump makes you feel every damn day.
Yeah.
And I think that's really critical.
That's a great point. Let's talk about Trump, Grace. What do you think was going through his brain as he watched this? He had some epic meltdowns on Truth Social.
Well,
over the course of the week.
To quote many Republicans who have supported Trump over the years, I don't know what's in his heart. So I can't say for sure what is going through his brain, but we do have the evidence of what he was posting about on Truth Social. We know that he was watching, which makes sense because we know he loves to watch TV. And we know that he was reacting to it in real time, which certainly indicates that he was being affected by it, that he felt personally attacked. And we know that when he feels personally attacked, which is quite often, he punches back. And so I think that's his Truth Social feed is a record of how he was feeling. His appearance on Fox News via phone interview after Harris's speech last night, which was very long, very rambling, and very indignant, I think is also an indication of how he was feeling. It remains to be seen whether there will be a convention bump for Harris. There usually is a convention bump for party nominees. But you know what was really most interesting to me out of all his reactions this week, because much of them are the same things we've heard for a long time, but the most interesting thing to me had nothing to do with the convention. It was a tweet cross-posted on Twitter and Truth Social talking about how much he is grateful for Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, and how he looks forward to using Kemp's political apparatus to win Georgia. And that's notable because Trump and Kemp do not have a good relationship. Trump has repeatedly disparaged Kemp. He disparaged Kemp's wife recently, which sources in Georgia tell me really, really angered Kemp in a way that, you know, attacking Kemp himself had not previously upset the governor as much as attacking his wife. Yeah. So there's a lot of bad blood between them. And for Trump to post to his social media that he loves Brian Kemp shows that he thinks he's in danger of losing Georgia. he thinks that it is a vulnerability for him, and he wants Kemp's very, very good political apparatus in that state. Whether it's enough to actually heal the bad blood between them, that's unclear. You know, Kemp will likely offer him his political aid because he's a Republican. But I don't think, like, Brian Kemp isn't going to be going to the mattresses for
Yeah.
Donald Trump in this
I
election.
think that's fair to say. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so that was the most interesting thing to me that Trump posted all week.
Greg, expanding it out from Trump, how do you think Trump world watched this debate? And meaning, you know, Chris LaCivita, Susie Wiles, who are running the campaign, and other high up Trump and Republican people.
Well, I think one really key tell is that Fox News figures have started to go out there and try to get Trump to change how he's approaching this election. And in particular, some of the most prominent people like Hannity and so forth have basically gone right out and said, you got to stop doing this, Donald. You got to stop personally attacking her, and you got to stick to policy, which is, you know, a euphemism. They don't actually mean stick to policy. They just mean lie about Harris in a way that doesn't alienate suburban women.
Right.
And so I got to think that there's communications underway. I don't know this firsthand, but it just seems like how it works. That the Trump campaign is probably communicating stuff to Trump through Fox News. Because, I mean, who wants to say that stuff directly to Trump himself? He'd erupt and, you know, throw his Big Mac at you. Right. So I think that was a key tell. It seems very clear to me that LaCivita and Wiles, as you mentioned, know that this is a serious problem for them. They know that you can't just make Harris's crowds disappear by claiming that they were generated by AI.
Yeah.
Right. And by the way, I do want to say that I think when Trump freaks out about Harris's crowds, I think that's a deeper tell than people usually sort of ascribe to it. It's usually treated as Trump just being crazy Trump.
Yeah.
But he really, I think, senses that there's this anti-MAGA movement, this majority out there that's been mobilized in a way that Biden could not mobilize.
Yeah.
Because he was just this wet blanket on everything, meaning Biden was.
Yeah.
And so he sees that the size of the America that's arrayed against him is big. And that's what he's reacting to when he lashes out at those crowds.
Let's go into some questions from people watching us, and thank you for hanging with us and submitting your questions. Someone named Anonymous Attendee asks, DNC organizers leaned heavily into reclaiming patriotism and freedom in so many ways. How effective do you think this will be in gaining never Trumpers and independence? Grace first, and then Greg.
It's difficult to say, and that's not the answer that you wanted. It's difficult to say. We know when we look at what scant polling there has been since Harris has become the presumptive and now the actual nominee, we know that she has been climbing up with independents. I think that, as I said before, the fourth night was a very deliberate appeal to those voters. And, you know, they're never Trumpers who feel betrayed by Haley endorsing Trump. And there's a chance that they just sit out the election entirely. There's a chance, you know, maybe they turn out and they vote for their senator, they vote for the representative, and they don't vote for president. But there probably is a chunk of people who are going to vote for Harris. We saw some of them highlighted on stage this week of Republicans who will vote for Harris. And again, in an election where it's going to be decided in a few states, it's going to be decided in those few states by a few thousand votes. That can make a difference. Everything could make a difference.
Greg?
You think it can be effective, but not necessarily by itself. I think the key thing is whether the Harris campaign can effectively rebut efforts to smear and tar her as an alien, threatening, dangerous figure, culturally threatening, culturally not like one of us, so forth and so on. And so by itself, I think the paeans to freedom and stuff sort of signal, they're meant to signal that she's a patriot, she's an American, she's one of us. But you also need the biographical stuff. You also need the middle class background emphasized heavily, and you also need the policies that are designed to curb costs and help the middle class as well. I think that all those things together are kind of the thing that has the chance at winning over some of the right-leaning independents and even maybe moderate Republicans that are really turning on Trump and
Yeah,
looking for an alternative.
yeah, I'll give my own answer to this. I think patriotism and the flag waving may indeed help convert some never Trumpers and independents. I think, that's something that Republicans always say about Democrats, and, waving the American flag, let's be honest, makes some people on the left uncomfortable, but I thought it was great. I thought it was fantastic. I think the Democrats need to do more of it, take that weapon out of the Republicans' hands, make people, in the middle of the road, independent swing voters, feel comfortable, with the party and what it aspires to be. So I think that does help. I think freedom is a more complicated thing. The Democrats are trying to redefine the word in ways, incidentally, that Michael Tomasky has been writing about for 2 years, but, let's set that aside for the moment. But they're trying to say, as Walz said in his speech, as many of them said in their speeches, and Josh Shapiro really pioneered this, they say it's freedom to it's not freedom to tell a woman what she can do with her body. It's not freedom to tell you who you can love. It's not freedom when the poor girl in a poor section of Philadelphia or Minneapolis or whatever doesn't have adequate funding for her school, so a new textbook so that she can go fulfill her highest potential. That's not freedom. Redefining freedom in that way, I think, is brilliant, and I think it's going to take time. But with respect to freedom as an abortion rights related question, I think that can make a difference in this election, I guess. And I think we're going to see a lot of working class women. I mean, you see that, Harris is closer among white working class voters to Trump than Biden was. And I suspect that's all women, and it has to do with abortion. If you guys want to comment on that, that's fine. But let me throw another question from a reader out here, or a viewer, pardon me. Here's someone who's asking, Harris addressed many key issues last night, but omitted mentioning climate, which this person found surprising and disappointing. Why do you think she skipped over this, Grace?
It's funny, I was joking with another convention attendee last night. Pretty much every 4 years, you have climate reporters writing articles about why aren't Democrats talking about climate enough in this convention.
Yeah.
I recommend you read the article on TNR by Kate Aronoff. There is a really good one in the Washington Post by Maxine Joselo. Democrats don't talk about climate enough in the conventions, and they have not for several conventions. There was a small sop to it with a video and a speech by Maxwell Alejandro Frost, who is a young up-and-coming Democratic congressman who represents Florida, a district in Florida, which obviously has been very affected by climate change. Honestly, I think the reason she didn't mention climate change in a significant way is because it's not a needle mover. And that's not to say that it shouldn't be a needle mover. It's obviously a deeply existential threat, especially for young voters who care very much about this. But there's an assumption that if you care about climate change, you're going to vote Democratic. And I think that she used more of her time on what she thought would move the needle in gaining voters. And that's the cold, hard political truth of it.
Greg?
I think this is yet another example of them calculating that they're attempting to tar her as a cultural elitist and an alien figure. And they think that among blue-collar whites, and especially in Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, that you can't really open the climate debate without losing some ground. I think that's an unfortunate thing. I actually had a piece on this for us, TNR.com.
Yeah.
But there's a way to talk about climate that is a winning way, I think, which is to say it's creating the manufacturing jobs of the future
Yeah.
for people with advanced manufacturing jobs, good jobs, that are well suited to people without a college degree, and creating them in places that have been left behind by globalization and so forth. The very areas that Trump and J.D. Vance rhapsodize about and constantly tell you that they care about. But I would be saying every single day, pretty much, that if Trump and Vance get in, they would repeal all these jobs that are being created in the industrial Midwest, good manufacturing jobs. Maybe they didn't think it was possible to get it into the convention speech effectively, but there's still time, right? Every day, Trump and Vance are attacking the green new scam, or whatever, the new, right? That's the term they use, the new green scam, or something like that, to describe the transition to EVs and other climate technologies. They could be rebutting that very forcefully by saying, we have an agenda for manufacturing workers, you've got nothing.
Yeah. Maybe it's easier to do that on the stump, to go to one of those places in Indiana or Illinois or Wisconsin or Michigan and showcase it that way. So they may do it like that.
Yeah, I would expect it. By the way, I just want to point out that one of the super PACs, Future Forward, which is a Biden super PAC, I believe they actually teamed up with a bunch of green groups to launch some ads, and one of the ads does make this point. It uses this messaging about green manufacturing jobs, that this is the way of the future, that they're the jobs of the future. So it's on the radar of the Harris campaign and the Democratic Party. I guess it's just sort of another tool in the toolbox. I don't know. We'll see how aggressively they use it, but they are kind of using it already.
They are. I think Trump is going to hit this point pretty hard, because it is true that manufacturing electric vehicles, as I understand it, from what I've read, requires in general fewer workers than manufacturing internal combustion vehicles. So that's something that I think is going to be an issue over the course of the next few weeks. Susan Levi or Levy writes to ask, this is interesting, I was talking about this with some people last night, what impact, if any, will the upcoming endorsement of Trump by RFK have in the campaign? And she also asks, what about Jill Stein? Will she make any difference? And I might as well throw Cornel West in there too, Grace.
Jill Stein and Cornel West, I don't think they'll make any meaningful difference. RFK Jr. throwing his weight behind Trump. I feel as if if this were happening a month and a half ago, it might make more of a difference. But polling was already showing that RFK Jr. was pulling more from Trump than from Biden. It's hard to say how much of a difference it will make. Right now, some polls are showing RFK Jr. with 1.5%, which is not as good as he was doing when Biden was still in the race, but that's still a pretty significant chunk. And I'm a broken record here, but in such a tight election, it's pretty significant if he actually could throw all of those voters behind Donald Trump. But I don't think that he will. I was enjoying the beautiful sights of Chicago in between meetings a couple days ago. I was at the Bean in Chicago, and in front of the Bean there was a teeny tiny RFK Jr. rally that was probably about 20 people touting their support for him into a megaphone. And the guy who was shouting into the megaphone was saying, and this is a direct quote, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are two sides of the same turd. And that does not exactly strike me as a guy who, once his candidate throws his support behind Donald Trump, will be like, oh, you know what? I was wrong, actually. I'm totally fine voting for the giant turd. I think that, maybe RFK Jr. supporters will flip their allegiance to Trump, and maybe a significant number of them will. But what I would really guess is that a lot of these people will just feel disaffected. Maybe they'll still write in his name. Maybe they won't vote at all. He's going to be on the ballot probably in several states. It may be too late to even take him off the ballot in the states where he has made it onto the ballot. So it's kind of difficult to say, but my short answer that I've made very long is that I think it would have made a much more of a difference if Biden were still the top of the Democratic ticket, but he's not.
Greg?
Yeah, I completely agree. And also I would add that it just seems to me that it's not going to make very much of a difference, both because of what you said earlier, Grace, which is that a lot of these people aren't going to vote, but also because if there's any type of voter whose support is soft for anyone, it's the RFK voters. Those are people who are very disaffected with politics, who hated Trump, who hated Biden, associated them with the establishment, I guess, something like that. But now they will be susceptible to appeals from the Harris campaign, which is aggressively trying to win young voters, especially. And we've already seen, by the way, that Harris has just jumped leaps and bounds over Biden among the youth vote as it is. So again, these are just not voters, they're anti-establishment voters. So I just don't know that they would even take an endorsement even from RFK and the great push-up king seriously. I mean, right? They just might not. They don't want to be told who to vote for. And so I think those voters will be susceptible to real appeals, even, I mean, if they show up, which, like Grace said, a lot of them probably won't.
I agree. And this was the sense of people I spoke to yesterday, generally, that there may be some impact, but that it just doesn't feel to people like it's going to be very high impact. I'm also going to throw out this one really crazy idea that two journalists I was talking with yesterday mentioned. One of them did it publicly on Twitter, so I'll mention his name. That was Charlie Pierce of Esquire. Another one did it to me privately over a lunch, so I don't want to say his name. But I was struck that both of these people, completely independent of each other, said there's a non-trivial chance that Trump dumps Vance and replaces him with RFK Jr. Not insane, is it?
Yeah.
I
mean,
insane, yes, but
genuinely, who is to say? Once again, we are in a very different world than we were in 33 days ago. 33 days ago, Biden was in it to win it. And now we just wrapped up a week with 50,000 people screaming after Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket. So genuinely, who is to say?
But
that strikes me as an insane thing, but I'm not going to bet against. I'm not going to bet against an insane thing happening.
Exactly. It's just nothing's impossible with that guy. It's 12:59, so I want to say we're going to have one last question. But I want to say thanks, Grace. Thanks, Greg. And I want to say to everyone who's watching, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time out of your Friday to join us. Please come to TNR.com every chance you can, every day. See what we're up to. I think we're producing a lot of interesting stuff, and I think we're going to be trying to do that for the next 76 days, and at this very fascinating and important time in our country's history. So let's close with a question from Barbara Nasberg, and it's a simple 5-word question. Will she win the election? Grace?
I don't know.
Say a little bit more than that. I know you don't want predictions, but just offer a couple of thoughts here.
Okay, sure. She could. That's what I'll say. She could win the election. And I think she has a better chance of winning the election right now than Joe Biden did.
Yeah.
I am not going to put percentages on it. I'm not going to make a prediction beyond that. But I would say she could win the election.
Greg?
I will stick my neck out a little more, but not much, and say that I think if the election were held today, she would win it. There are some big unknowns ahead. I don't think we know whether she's going to get a sizable convention bump or not, because she may have already gotten something like the convention bump that we usually anticipate with her surprise announcement and the intense attention that was paid to her over the last month or so. But I think it's hers to. I think she's favored now. I think that's pretty clear. She's up a couple, about 2 to 3 points in the national averages. She's ahead in all 3 blue wall states: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Although I will say Pennsylvania is extremely close, uncomfortably close. She's edging up in Arizona. She has more paths than Trump does, I think, right now, and there's not any clear reason, unless the debate goes terribly for her, which, after watching that speech, I think is unlikely. There may not even be a debate after that speech. That's another matter. But it seems pretty clear to me that she's narrowly favored.
I would agree with everything you said, and I'll just stick my neck out just one teeny bit further than that. I sense a tremendous burst of enthusiasm on the Democratic and liberal and progressive side that may largely go unreported and unseen, because news organizations still would rather send people out to interview MAGA folks than liberals. But I think there's an army out there that wants to elect Kamala Harris, but perhaps more to the point, wants to stop Donald Trump from returning to the White House.
There's no such thing as an unseen liberal voter.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
That I'll get behind.
Hey, listen, thanks everybody. And please join us again in the future for one of these. Have a good weekend.